All right, so welcome everyone back to the virtual lean learning experience, the VLX. Today we are here for a panel discussion with our speakers from Tuesday. LEI's founder and board member Jim Womack, and LEI's senior advisor, recent COO of Rivian, Jim Morgan. And I am Josh Howell. I'll be moderating the discussion today. I am the president of the Lean Enterprise Institute. So one thing that sort of occurred to us upon reflection on the sessions on Tuesday is that it's quite possible that not everyone who's joining us is totally familiar with the Lean Enterprise Institute and all that we do. You're obviously familiar with the fact that we put on virtual learning experiences, although in fact this is the first such activity. But we thought we would just quickly sort of share an overview of what the Lean Enterprise Institute does. So many of you may be familiar with lean.org. That's the website of the Lean Enterprise Institute that we've had up and running for nearly the entire 23 years of the Institute's existence. We do bring the Lean community together. Traditionally, we do that in the form of annual summits. In the springtime, we conduct the Lean Summit. In fact, this year we had intended to gather the community together in Carlsbad, California, but obviously we're unable to do that due to the pandemic. And then in the late summer, early fall, we convene the Lean Product and Process Development community for a summit called Designing the Future. LEI also offers education around various lean practices, methodologies in different ways. In the public sphere, where we gather individuals from different organizations together, and then individually with companies, organizations that are looking for specific know-how to apply in a situational way. Of course, LEI, since before its existence, our founder, Jim Womack, has authored multiple books, including the aforementioned Machine That Changed the World, Lean Thinking, Lean Solutions. So we were born as founded by an author and born to be a book publisher. LEI has published nearly one book every year in its existence, just over 20 titles that are available, all of which I think are on the bookshelf over my left shoulder. And then additionally, LEI engages with individual organizations through what we call co-learning partnerships or LPPD partnerships, where organizations are attempting to address specific business issues. LEI supports those organizations to the best of our ability, sharing the know-how that we have amassed over the years. And in the process of engaging directly with organizations at their gemba, helping to solve their business problems, we learn. One of the things we want to always demonstrate is the attitude of humble learners. And so through the practice of being with you side by side, solving problems at your gemba, it's a tremendous opportunity for LEI to continue to learn about these lean ideas that we've been discovering and exploring over the last several decades. So anyway, just wanted to provide an overview of that. Okay, so that's not the reason you're here. The reason you're here is to hear from Jim Womack and Jim Morgan in response to the things that are on your mind, the questions that you have. So the main function for this session is going to be the Q&A function in Zoom. As you can see here, you can simply type your questions, and there is the opportunity for the group, for the crowd, to sort of vote on questions kind of up or down to express your interest in having a particular question answered or not. So as the moderator, I'll be monitoring the questions that you pose and using those to ask Jim and Jim. Additionally, during the sessions on Tuesday, we were left with quite a few questions that we simply didn't have time to address on Tuesday. So I have in front of me on my little desk here quite a number of questions that were left over from Tuesday. You've also been posing questions on the Slack channel over the last 48 hours or so. So I have all of those questions in front of me as well. And I will do my best to get all of the best questions that you've posed and will pose over the next hour asked to Jim and Jim. You'll forgive me if I don't pose your question. I will do the best that I can. All right. So to kick us off, I'm going to sort of look at a theme that ran across several questions that we received on Tuesday and that we received over the last 48 hours. There was a number of questions about our poster child company, Toyota. And in particular, folks are interested in kind of what Toyota is doing nowadays. They're responding to the crises and the pandemic, like all of us. But even beside that, and before that began, they've been tackling many of the challenges that you, Jim Womack, called out in your presentation on Tuesday. And so I'd like to start there by asking kind of each of you as long-term observers of that company, sort of what do you see that Toyota is doing today to address the modern challenges that all of us are as well, pandemic or not. Maybe I'll begin with you, Jim Womack. Thank you.
Yeah, well, Toyota, if you remembered, in 1950 ran out of cash in a crisis, and they said that will never happen again. So for the last 70 years, they have been carrying a mountain of cash with them. And they had to do a lot of work to get all that cash in place. $60, $70 billion in cash as the pandemic started. And so therefore, they've got the ability not to have to abandon their people. Through this crisis, all of the permanent employees of Toyota have been retained. They have some contract workers in some of the plants, and the contracts run out and sales are way off. Well, then they don't renew those contracts. But for the great bulk of folks who are there, they've been able to make continuity of employment. So that's a big advantage that I suspect a lot of people on this call work in companies they haven't had. But okay, it is what it is. Second, they entered the crisis with the best defined and most stable processes out there for product and process development, for fulfillment through production, for sustaining their suppliers. And that's a tremendous advantage. If you've got stability, you've got the foundation to work off of. And if you absolutely understand every process, what's really happening right now, and you need to change it, well, that's a lot easier than trying to take a lot of time to figure out what the current state really is, because it's not what it's supposed to be. It's not what's written down. So those are big advantages that Toyota had going into this. And that's, of no comfort to folks who didn't have those advantages. But for the future, it's really something to think about. So that is the advantage. Now, as I said on Tuesday, I've got no Gemba to call on. I haven't been out of Trevitt, Maine, population 200, since the 15th of March, except to go to the hospital in Boston, not for very long, fortunately. So the truth is, on the ground, I can't tell you. I do know one other thing about Toyota, which is the willingness of people to, redo the work, rethink the work. We have a wonderful example coming up from GE Appliance, in which they actually, for a lack of line workers, they got their lawyers and accountants to go out and assemble appliances. Well, my guess is Toyota could do the same thing. If you have an extremely clear standard work and everything is really properly visualized, you can just a lot more quickly get people who wouldn't normally be doing things to go do them. So that those are all big advantages. There's a bigger question with Toyota, which I don't have much time we want to spend on, that Jim Morgan could talk about as well. That Toyota decided a couple of years ago that basically the world was coming to an end for legacy car companies. They decided that going forward, that people really want very different types of products provided in very different types of ways, connected through very different information technology medium. and that they better get to work on it. And that's where that mountain of cash comes in as well, that they have been doing experiments on electric vehicles, on hybrids, on fuel cells. Nobody else has really got the breadth of experimentation in those areas. And they've been doing experiments with asset sharing. They do this often by making investments in companies like Uber. And they've been working very hard on autonomy, both to develop their own autonomy, if it turns out you can really do that, and to develop an alternative system called Guardian, that rather than taking you where you want to go, it simply in the background keeps you from killing yourself as you try to take you there yourself. And then there's the connectivity. Okay, so a tremendous amount of what we would call concurrent engineering. They're trying fuel cells, they're trying electric, they're trying the next iteration of hybrid, they're trying different forms of ride sharing. They've been building a city at the base of Mount Fuji in Japan, which they're trying to weave together all of these new themes into a coherent whole. Costs a lot of money to build a city for experimentation purposes, but that is the experimental nature of Toyota. None of that at a fine grained level right now necessarily involves their OpEx people, their CI people, but for the longer term it does, because they do want to involve that mentality, that mindset as early as possible in planning new projects.
Jim Morgan, how about you? What do you see that?
So I think Jim talked about most of the things that I would bring up. I would extend his example. I think for the pandemic, first of all, I should say I haven't been to Japan. I haven't spent a lot of time at Toyota probably in 2 years. So I don't have any particular insight into specifically what they're doing. But in the work I've done with other companies, those that had pretty robust systems set up to begin with did much better when the pandemic hit, and they were able to continue those practices. Jim talked about GE Appliance. I think the work they did establishing standard work, training their group leaders, things like that, enabled them to be able to bring in other people and quickly get them up to speed and continue to build quality products. I think the same is true in product development. Teams that had a robust cadence and were doing things like Obeya and visual management well, I think we're able to make the transition much more successfully than were others. Having a bunch of cash, absolutely. There's no doubt that that's a big asset. I think, sort of shifting to the larger change in the auto industry, that cash becomes even more important. And I've read a number of articles now where their CEO, Akio, talks about how they're working harder than ever to be efficient in manufacturing, to continue to generate cash so they can do the experiment. And they are experimenting, as far as I know, more broadly than anybody else. So they're clearly taking a set-based approach, looking at multiple potential solutions to the changes that all of the automakers face right now, and working towards converging on a solution.
Josh, let me say, I think a separate question worth considering here is how you do Genchi Genbutsu, that's go see, ask why, or how you more narrowly do Gemba in a time in which you physically can't go. And that is an interesting separate topic of how to think about that, which is absolutely, I think, a key thing that we're going to learn about coming out of this. Hey, just a final thing that just to share an irritation that the media in particular are convinced that lean is fragile. And there was another outrageous article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago saying that all the problem in the pandemic of running out of everything from ventilators to Bounty paper towels was due to the massive embrace by the world of JIT. Well, the two things wrong with the argument is that the world has not massively embraced JIT. There's some car guys that have really done a good job. Toyota, of course, has done the best, but JIT is mostly, advocated rather than practiced. But the other thing, it's simply not fragile, that it's actually quite robust. Its ability to respond quickly to what's going on rather than work off of some forecast that is even more than usual wrong. So that's a different part of the pandemic response, but one that coming out of this, I hope we'll be able to show some examples of a robust lean response and why it's not fragile at all.
Yeah, good. Well, so related to the point you brought up, and Jim Morgan, you mentioned Akio. For those of us that pay attention to that company, to Toyota, and things that company says publicly, communicates with all of us. It was just a couple of months ago that a bit of a dust up was created by some remarks that Akio Toyota made, sort of questioning the practice or reflecting on the practice of Ginji Gambutsu, of going to see and being physically present. And of course, that's difficult to do at a time of social distancing, hunkering down in Maine and northern Michigan and just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, or wherever we may be. So Joel Huggins asked a question here in the chat, and there were several questions that came on Tuesday around that, around the challenge of continuing to practice that principle of Ginchi Gambutsu, of going to see, of gathering the facts directly for ourselves at a time of social distancing. So curious kind of what your thoughts are around that, around maybe even what Akio said a couple of months ago. We'll go with that.
Well, my thought is that a lot of people, when they heard Ginchi Gambutsu, they heard that the senior executives are supposed to go rushing off to assess every problem. And that's just not true. If you look at the Toyota plant and you look at daily management in the Toyota plant, the frontline team leaders are supposed to flag anything that's gone wrong that wasn't dealt with the previous day, and then tell the group leader to see if the group leader can deal with it in terms of a stable countermeasure. And if not, well, then you put it up to the area person, and then you go to the operations, the assembly manager. And finally, only issues that can't be dealt with wind up at the president's morning in the Obeya discussion of how they're doing. So that only a few things, a very few things that could not be dealt with at lower levels would require anybody to go anywhere. But I've been going to daily management meetings at Toyota for a long time, and it's almost never the case that the top leader has to go running somewhere to look at something, because the people who are reporting the problems bring videos, they bring examples of parts, they bring examples of tooling problems or whatever for everybody to look at in the Obeya. So therefore, the notion that Ginchi Gambutsu is senior managers just flying all over the world to look at every problem is just wrong. There are big problems, big things that come up in which it really would be helpful if the senior people could go see. And that's what Akio was talking about, and saying that in his previous life, he had been spending an awful lot of time on planes going to see. And as a practical matter, he just couldn't do that. So therefore, what is the countermeasure for the senior folks needing to fully understand? And by the way, it's not to go give the answer, it's to go make sure everybody's asking the right questions, and then to ask, how can I help you? That's what a person needs to do in that context. So we'll see what they work out. We're all struggling with video. We had only 2 panics in the last hour trying to get this thing to go. And we've been on Zoom for 6 months. And we had this emergency safety thing we had worked out, and it turned out it crashed the system when you tried to use it. So we've all got a lot to learn about how we can go with visual media to places that we cannot go molecularly. And Toyota is certainly working on that, but then everybody's working on that. And by the way, for LEI, I think that would be a great knowledge base to tap and share about what people have learned about how you go see when you can't go see. Because it's a functional thing. The going to see is being able to really grasp the situation and talk directly to the people who are engaged in it and say, what's going on? What's your countermeasure? How can I help? So that's a matter of practice to see what we can come up with. I certainly think these tools we got right now, all the Zooms and Skypes and all that, are early days. They're all fiddly, they're not stable. We love stability in the lean world. So it's really early days on those, but we all need to learn together.
It's clear we have a lot to learn. I think at least part of what Akio was referring to is what I used to call industrial tourism. A big group of people would go go to the plant, and half of them wouldn't know what they were looking at anyway. So you have to kind of scratch your head and say, would their time be better spent, elsewhere? And so I think he was reflecting a bit on that. And to another point you made, design reviews is a topic I talk about a lot. And the best design reviews are at the Gemba, or at the tool shop, or at the prototype build, or at the plant, where you can physically see things. But you can also improve design reviews by having the parts there, by having the data there, by having the CAD there. That's also the Gemba, so that you're not looking at a PowerPoint report, you're actually looking at the design data itself, or you're looking at the specific test results itself. And so there's things that you can do remotely fairly effectively. But I do think we have a great deal to learn. We've worked with a number of our partner companies to transfer their Obeya stand-ups to a virtual world with mixed results. Some have done pretty well, some are continuing to struggle, and we are learning as we go.
Well, generally, just to add to that, I think the most interesting part of it is that good Obeya practice is a social process and an emotional process, as well as a technical process. And everybody's there standing close together, not supposed to do that anymore, and making promises to each other about, okay, we've agreed, this is a mess, it's red, we got to do something, here's the countermeasure. And each of us are saying we will deliver on our piece of the solution, right? And that's very powerful. To actually be just standing right there with someone and say out loud, I will support you, I will get it done by tomorrow. Can you do that electronically so effectively? I don't know, but it's a very interesting question to me, is the social, emotional angle, more even than the technical angle.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Jim Morgan, just kind of to wrap this up a little bit, have you, in your own work with organizations or in observing companies that are having to deal with this pivot to everyone being remote and everything happen online, have you seen any specific technologies or sort of tools that are really helping with that?
Not specifically. There are many more tools available now to help with that, and some of them are pretty good. There's Trello, and there's what is it, iObeya. I mean, there's a bunch of softwares out there that can be helpful, but I think it goes back to the social part that Jim was just talking about. The teams that get it, that get the sort of spirit of Obeya, the ones that have established that level of professional trust and work together, that are, really believe in transparency, that has, I think, largely transferred into the virtual world. The question is can you sustain that? Where the biggest challenges are is if you're onboarding new members who haven't been sort of immersed in the culture, haven't built these relationships. In my experience, much more challenging than folks that have built relationships and have worked together before. So the question will be more around sustaining, and I suspect that the long-term answer will be some mixed model going forward, depending on the specific circumstances.
Yeah, something I've thought about during these last 6 months is really on that kind of social side of things and sort of relationship building or starting new relationships through my Zoom screen versus standing side by side with someone, being able to make actual molecular eye contact. Another question kind of related to that is when working in a new setting with a lack of Gemba, how do you go about choosing the best lean tools to fit the situation and implement improvements?
So I'll let you go, Jim Womack.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, first off, the place always to start is what is the situation? Grasp the situation. And what is the problem? What is the problem? And it's easy to say, whoa, we need some new tools because times have changed. So we need some new tools. Let's get some new tools. That in general is pretty frustrating because there's actually not a match between what the tools can do and what you need done. And so pandemics don't have any effect on the fact that we still need to reach agreement on the current situation, what the problem is. And then the range of countermeasures. I'm always struck when I go to places and ask, well, you've done this new thing. How many alternatives did you consider? We bought this fancy new kit, this fancy new software. And it's almost always, well, gee, once we got the problem, we had to go fast. So this seemed like a good solution. So we did it. And okay, you can do that. That's certainly not the lean way of thinking about it. Is why can't we think of 3 or 4 different ways to do this? And then walk through how's this going to work? And maybe we could do some simple experiments, the minimum viable prototype before we go all in on a technical answer that may not actually match the problem. And even if it does, it may not actually work. Okay, so pandemic doesn't change the underlying fundamental problem that we all face. It does make it in some cases harder to work closely together. Yeah. To be able to come up with the best solution.
Yeah, just to extend that a bit. I always start with 2 questions. What problem are we trying to solve? And what do we think good looks like, right? Because I think oftentimes people don't have very clear in their mind what the solution space looks like at all. And the other side of investing in technologies, some of these technologies are incredibly expensive. And so once you've made that leap, you're just sort of defending your position, right? We've invested in this technology and we are going to make this successful by hook or by crook kind of thing. And that can really take you off course. And so that's the other piece that I would mention is not only try lots of options, look broadly, as you said, try and experiment. What's the minimum viable prototype that you can try it with? But also, I think, and this is one of the things that I see maybe the startups are better at than more established companies is when you realize you've gone down a wrong path, you got to be willing to blow it up, right? You got to be willing to say, hey, just like most experiments, this one didn't work and we need to try something else. And I think that's an important attitude to go forward with.
If I could just say one, it sounds strange, but one good thing about Tesla, that they invested how much, who knows, maybe $1 billion in trying to automate final assembly. And then they decided one afternoon, this ain't gonna work. And they literally blew it up. If that had been GM, or I might say Jim Ford in the old days, they would have put teams together about how can we protect our investment in this nonsense. And by the way, we can't say the big bosses blew it. So the lean team would be turned loose to try to figure out how to make the unworkable work, which is just totally crazy. So sometimes the right answer is, hey, it's a big experiment. It's a pity it's such a big, expensive experiment. And the hypothesis is rejected. This doesn't work. Get the Simtex. Let's blow this stuff up.
That's exactly right. And I think a willingness to do that, I give Elon a lot of credit for that. He said, "Hey, I was wrong, right? And so we're going to learn from this, and we're going to work on it." And so, and that's something I saw a lot more of in the startup world, as opposed to just throwing good money after bad. It's an old mentor of mine once told me that when you dig yourself a hole, the first thing to do is to put down the shovel, right? And so I think we have to be willing to do that.
So continuing sort of along those lines, on topic of Tesla, technology, also back to the auto industry. Interesting question here from our friend Paulo. What's our assessment about the turmoil going on in the stock market? Tesla and Silicon Valley companies compared to Toyota market cap. Is it just speculation, or is something deeper related to the notion of clients buying stuff, scrapping and replacing it fast?
Well, look, we all have our views. So let me cite Toyota again. that Toyota, on the face of it, is a publicly traded company, okay? And the 300 members of the Toyota group of supplier companies are all also stock market traded. But it turns out, if you actually attempted to buy any of them, you can't do it, because more than 50% of the shares in all of the companies are owned by the other members of the group. So they decided way, way back when they did not want to be subject to the stock market. And what they wanted was to be able to plan for the long term, to have continuity. And the way to do that was to grow from retained earnings rather than having to, always be issuing more shares to grow. And so that advice, I think, has been pretty much lost on most everybody else. And people do get into these stock market situations that are just totally crazy. To me, it's just really a casino, a bunch of day traders at the retail level, and a bunch of big guys with big money who, again, are trying to get quarterly returns. And this is terrible. This is a terrible, horrible thing, okay? By the way, you could say, well, whoa, Toyota doesn't pay any attention to the shareholders. They don't have to. And the answer is, well, gee, that's funny. They've done a fantastic job of shareholder return over the last 70 years. So by not paying attention to the short term, they did a brilliant job in the long term. And gosh, I wish more people thought that way. Now, for those of you in CI and OpEx operations, and you discover you just got sold, and this is the third time you've been sold. And not only that, they had a bad quarter, so now we're going to lay off, a third of the team, or maybe we're going to demand that the team produce twice as many results in the next quarter. That's the way the world, I guess, wants to work, but it's not the lean way of working.
Yeah, I certainly don't understand the stock market or the reasons behind specific market capitalizations. A lot of it doesn't make sense to me, but clearly Tesla has done an incredible thing. I mean, they started an auto company, and they've been, depending on your metric, fairly successful so far. In terms of software and propulsion, I would say they're leading. So not only did they start an auto company, but they're leading in certain categories. I think in other areas, maybe not so much, quality of build, especially the body build and things like that. But they have sold the dream, and they've backed it up with some breakthrough technology in the auto industry, and people are rightly excited about that. And other established auto companies are now chasing them in certain areas. And so you certainly can understand why people would be excited about that. And I had the privilege to work with some former Tesla folks, and they're fantastic. They're great. They have a lot to be proud of. They were there during the early years. I can tell you, starting an auto company is not easy. And so what they've accomplished is pretty incredible. And so I think people are rightly impressed with that. But we'll see. I mean, time will tell. We could get into the profitability, and I mean, there's lots of other metrics in terms of, success of an auto company, and I guess we'll see over time. But explaining speculation in the stock market, you'd have to talk to somebody much smarter than me.
Fair enough. So we've talked quite a lot already about, two industries, manufacturing and technology. There's a question here around what industries outside of manufacturing, from your experience, are in most need of lean thinking?
Wow.
Well, as we look at the world, what isn't? The world is still, about 90% muda by content. So that when you say what's your need, one way to look at it is how much stress are you under? There are some industries that aren't very good, but they don't have any disruption going on, and the customers don't know any better. And so therefore, it's likely that they're not going to be leaders in trying to convert waste into value, right? And there are others that are under a lot of pressure. By the way, I think one of the things that's going to happen in healthcare, no matter how the debate on access works out. You know, big political debate on access. Whereas I spend my time thinking about delivery and about how incredibly costly it is to do seemingly very simple things. So that has to be dealt with at some point, because otherwise, with all of us boomers like me, you know, hey, I've been spending a lot of your Medicare money in the last year, that we're really going to have to rethink how we deliver healthcare and even what healthcare means. And that's very different from the question of who's going to pay. So there's an industry right there that we've tried. I must say that I think some of our efforts have been a bit in the spirit of do it to them. And there's been an immune reaction. There are a lot of people out in healthcare who are lean people who don't use the term lean anymore, because they think once the consultants got through doing gazillions of Kaizens for quick payback, that it really created a very bad atmosphere. So what industries need it? Well, the answer is all of them. What industries particularly need it? Well, I would put healthcare at the top of the list, but we have to be realistic about our contribution so far and how we have explained what needs to be done in a way that seems to enable good things rather than punish bad things.
Yeah, healthcare was the first industry that came to mind for me. Not so much as an indictment of healthcare in itself, just that it is so important to us as a global community. Honestly, it is crucial that we get this right. My sort of observation from limited exposure is that we've done a lot of what Jim talked about yesterday, and that's Kaizen that is largely rework in healthcare of existing processes. And what I'm particularly excited about, I think I mentioned this yesterday, is the work that the Michigan Medicine folks are doing in designing new clinical processes, applying these principles up front to redesign some of the patient experience. The other one that I would mention that we've talked about a lot, and I don't know if we've made any progress, is in higher education and secondary education. I think the pandemic has created a bit of a crisis for our friends in the academic environment. But I think even before that, we were seeing declining enrollments in MBAs and things like that. And so I think that is another area that there may be some opportunity in.
Well, so for any of these industries, higher ed, technology, healthcare, construction is another one. For the industries that could really use it, oftentimes sort of making the successful pitch is a challenge that many of us lean practitioners have to face. We have a question here from Brian around who works in lean construction. He says, our largest impediment to lean thinking as an industry has been the lack of adoption by the owners and the developers. Any advice for a great elevator pitch to sway these folks? And I guess that could be true. We could think about for any business executive in a position of influence over their organization that really does need lean thinking. What could we say to those folks?
Well, it's interesting that construction was practically the first industry outside of automotive that tried to get with the program. The term lean construction was introduced in 1990 or 91. There has been for all of that time since then an annual big meeting of the Lean Construction Institute, and there's a sort of parallel academic meeting. A tremendous amount of thinking about how you would do lean construction. And the problems you deal with are that it's very, very hard to get value defined at the outset. That's the same way that value is going to be defined at the end. It's amazing how much of construction is rip out and rework after the client could not actually imagine quite what they needed. So the contractor and the architect went ahead and designed it. And then as it becomes a physical reality, you saw, well, oh, wait a minute, we forgot about the X factor, the Y factor, the Z factor. So that's one of the problems with your elevator pitch to the developer, that what you need to have is a mutual way of being sure you know what you're doing before you start off to do it. And that's not the way those folks think. The important thing is to get started. You know, there's a lot of politics and a lot of development assistance and government stuff in there. And so there's really kind of a rush to get the project done, to get it started, and then all kinds of things ensue. The flip side of the elevator pitch is the guy standing in the other side of the elevator is the supplier, who is an independent business, who has no loyalty to the contractor, who is working for all of the contractor's competitors and is making all kinds of promises that in fact can't work. And so then as you get into it, there is continuous negotiation about everything that has to be done, when's it going to be done, who's going to do it, how are we going to do it. That, by the way, is the virtue of the last planner meeting, where every morning you get all of the subs together with the contractor to decide what you can actually do that day. It's not what's on the plan, because you don't have the subs, or you don't have the raw materials, or you don't have the building inspector's permit or whatever. So that's it's the one case in construction where a social context has been created. It's that morning last planner OBEA meeting to stand in front of each other and make promises on what each of the players can deliver that day. Now, what a pity. You can't do the same thing with the developers, and you can't do the same thing with the contractor, the subcontractor owners, to develop a stable way of working together. So for the person asking the question, boy, you've got a tough one. I wish you the best. Experiments, hey, get in an elevator and try some speeches. I don't know what else to do. That I should say no one in the industry at this point has the answer. But hey, that's good. That's opportunity. And there's certainly a lot of pain. So we need to keep trying experiments.
Yeah, so I don't have any specifics to offer within the construction industry, but having had a number of senior roles in the past, and I can tell you that in those roles, people are really busy and they have a ton of problems to solve. And so this might be obvious, but I think starting with what are their real business problems, staying away from a lot of jargon and dogma, and focusing on how can you help the business be more successful? How can you help that individual be more successful? And planning your talk around that, I think you have a much, much better chance of getting their attention than to show up in the elevator and start talking about Toyota.
Yeah, it is a question. LEI obviously is in regular dialogue with many members out there in the lean community. That is often a question that we get asked, is for help in kind of pitching or selling lean to a top executive. So it's an understandable question for sure. But yeah, my answer generally is along the same lines as what you just said, Jim Morgan, which is identify what business need that executive is most interested in, worried about, focused on, and strike up a conversation around that, and how lean thinking might be a way to engage and tackle that challenge. So getting started is one thing. In whatever industry you might be in, many of us are working for organizations that have gotten started and that might be struggling at some point in time with their lean transformation, their lean implementation. So there have been a number of questions coming in related to that, around sort of the challenge of transformation and what we have learned about that process over the years and what we can do better or differently going forward. Jim Morgan, one question that came in for you was a question around if you could give an example of a successful lean product and process development kind of implementation, and maybe an example of one that was not so successful, and what you learned from the differences in those two experiences. Of course, you don't you work for you. You work as a senior advisor for the Lean Enterprise Institute. You don't work for organizations that are tackling these things day in and day out today. So you may be limited with what you can share exactly. But certainly you've learned some things over the years, and there's interest in gleaning your know-how around that topic.
Yeah. Gosh, we probably could have started with that question and spent the whole hour on it. And you're right. I can't talk about specific programs or companies or things like that. Would be completely inappropriate. But I do think starting with a real need is crucially important. If it doesn't matter to the business, it's hard to get the resources and the attention and the the sort of focus, I guess, that is required. I think that willingness to pivot, to use a term I'm not particularly fond of, but the willingness to just burn it down, to blow it up and start all over is incredibly important. When we were talking about implementing lean principles and practices with a sense of urgency, with a business that was starting to get up and running, it was extremely important not to just continue to chase something that was clearly not working, and be willing to just sort of start over again. Excuse me. So I think those are all important, sort of, helping the business fundamentals, being willing to try the experiment and pivot when it doesn't work, engaging people, sort of JIT with training, right? Not to outrun your learning as you're starting to implement this stuff, finding programs to pilot on so it's part of the real world, not spending a bunch of time on jargon and dogma and we must do this and we must do that. Thinking from first principles and then reasoning from first principles, I think are all elements or characteristics of successful implementation and successful programs. Also, creating a situation, whether it's the product itself or the implementation of the system, where it becomes aspirational. So during my time at Ford, when Mullally was there, that inspiration was such a big part of what we were doing and what we wanted to be part of. During my time at Rivian, many of the people there are there because they really believe in what Rivian stands for and what they're trying to accomplish, and making them a part of them, being inclusive, and enrolling people in that is also hugely important. In terms of the downside, I think there's lots of things that I could cite. Not doing enough front in the study period, not really understanding your customer in context, whether it's for a program or for implementation, not having a clear view of what good looks like and what problem we're trying to solve. I think all those things, not engaging all the right people, trying to do it sort of in a small pocket. But the biggest disasters that I've seen in terms of programs is when you skip steps, right? When you say, we're gonna shorten our lead time by eliminating this or this, right? Because we don't need it anymore. We don't need to build, physical prototypes. We don't need to, have, production tryout builds. We don't need, whatever. And you eliminate them without a countermeasure, right? You eliminate them without an enabler. Those are the programs that I think, struggle the most.
Let's see, Josh, could I just say one word about that?
Please.
That I've been doing this for a long time. And what I find that is an important enabler of success is that there's an actual engagement between the improvement folks and the line management. We came into this in a sort of a bad way back, say 1990, when everybody was in a big hurry to do lean, and people set up lean teams that were sort of inspired by the OMCD folks at Toyota, who would basically do lean to people. And they would show up and say, okay, this week we will move all the machines. And we've done a quick assessment. We know we'll be better off to get out of process village and into product family value streams. And we brought our pry bars and all kinds of other equipment, and we're going to do it. And I've watched a gazillion of those way back when. And the problem was that almost none of it could be sustained at the level that was achieved at the end of the improvement cycle, because in fact, the line management really had no experience in how to run a stable process. They themselves had no knowledge of how you improve. Mm-hmm. And so an unfortunate dependency relationship came up that the line folks, anytime something either went wrong or someone said, you need to improve, said, I believe I'll outsource that to the improvement team. And hey, the improvement team's happy to get started. Great, more work. But downstream, this may not lead anywhere because in fact, there is no real engagement and there's no development of managers. So Toyota some years ago changed the name OMCD to OMDD, which is the Operations Management Development Division. And they now see their job as developing line managers who can do the things that they used to do. So they now become coaches, enablers, educators, rather than do it people. And that for them has been a formula that's worked well. You don't see that so much elsewhere. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for experimentation there.
It actually reminds me of another failure mode that I didn't mention that I should, and that's organizations that try to transplant directly what they were doing in the factory into the product development system without really understanding the unique nature of that environment. And you turn off engineers and developers and designers really quick when you show up and decide the best thing you can do is draw a circle around their wastebasket or something. So really understanding the environment and the challenges is critically important as well.
Speaking of understanding the environment and environments changing over time, and the relationship to sort of the impact, the importance of people both engaged in the effort and capable of contributing. An interesting question here. Any suggestions on what lean thinking organizations need to do in terms of how they view or think about the people pillar of lean as technology adoption increases? What should happen to the social contract with employees?
Yeah. Well, it is interesting that we've now had a lot of experience with labor arbitrage, where starting in the 80s, American managers said, well, we could either improve our productivity and our quality right where we are, or we could find somebody on the opposite side of the world who would do it cheap, okay? And you can do that, and a lot of people did that. In history, that almost always leads at some point to an explosion in which the people who have been dropped and left behind get pretty upset, and there is a political response to that. So that now we know all about that. Now we're looking at Industry 4.0. And by the way, it can't happen as quickly as the vendors want to tell you. You have to remember Amara's law, which is that any new technology is thought to advance much more quickly in the short term than it does, but actually goes further in the long term than you expected. So right now we've kind of got the hype curve of all kinds of new things with AI and so forth that can do things that they may not be able to do just right now. But certainly the attitude of a lot of the people who are developing those is that actually we get rid of people. We don't really need management because we won't have any people. And it's all going to be code. And well, some people even think that's good. But that I not just predict, I absolutely insist will produce some very bad social reaction. So that there is a need to think when you're improving a process, and perhaps by adding a lot of new technology, what is your obligation to the people? What are you going to do with them? And the Toyota stance has always been, we will stand by our people. That once you come into the system, we will find a way to support you. And that is not negotiable. So for most of the rest of the world, that's not the way they think. And, you know, we'll give you a buyout, or we'll give you, that's what we'll give you. We'll give you a buyout and goodbye.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a bad thing on a human standpoint. And it's a bad thing from the success of process improvement for the long term. So, hey, let's hope we have some ability to learn.
Yeah. So with just 5 minutes left, I've got, I think, one more question to start with. We'll start with you, Jim Morgan. I think this is a great question to end our session on. Do you have any advice for young professionals who are still developing confidence in their new role in their organization and are struggling to apply the lean concepts they learned in school to the much more difficult real-life scenarios?
That is a good question. And I think that's not just true for young people, that's true for all people, especially as the environment continues to change, right? We're in such a dynamic environment right now that adapting these principles to that environment is a huge challenge and a necessary one. And so I think that's the first thing, is to think in terms of reasoning from first principles to fit the environment you're at, as opposed to cut and pasting solutions that you might have seen or read about or heard from your professor, and force fitting those into that environment. I would back up another step. When I have the privilege to speak at universities, I'm very often asked about careers and things like that by the students afterwards. And the thing that I think is most important is fit. I think assessing your fit in the organization in terms of your own values and your own work practices and what matters to you is crucial. I think people who have a good fit, and there's no right or wrong, it's just what's a good fit for you. And if you're in the right environment, you'll thrive. And if you're in the wrong environment, no matter how bright you are, you're going to really struggle, because the forces are just going to continue to beat you down all the time. And so if you're a lean innovator and you are passionate about this work, you should absolutely fight the good fight. But at some point, you have to figure out if you're a good fit or not.
You mentioned, Jim, just quickly, Jim Womack, you mentioned, Jim Morgan, the term a couple of times, first principles. Could you quickly just explain what you mean by that for folks that may not know?
Yeah, so instead of starting with a specific practice that you want to implement, understanding why that practice exists, right? So we talked a lot today, Jim and I both, about Obeya. Obeya is a practice that's based on creating transparency and cadence, right? Identifying reds, creating the right environment, all that kind of stuff. But the purpose of all that is so that the team can work together well. So what I, would rather have people think about is development is a team sport, and what can we do to enable people to collaborate and coordinate and communicate, as opposed to how do I do Obeya?
Got it. That's helpful. Thank you. Jim Womack, I cut you off. Sorry. What advice do you have for the young?
Just say that in its nature, lean is an experimental process. The only way we know that something's been improved is we try to improve it. And the only way you can internalize tools and methods and mindsets is by actually applying them. That we know, and you can't do it in the classroom. I've written a lot of books. Thank you for buying them, but I don't think you can go from reading a book to being a senior seasoned practitioner. You have to go through the step of trying things. So that if I were a young person and I'm looking at my situation going forward, hey, there's some just technical stuff that I need to master, and that's in videos and books. You can figure that out. But mainly what you need is an environment where you will be allowed to try things. And in my career, going all the way back, I concluded real early that the key thing in interviewing for a job is to interview the boss while the boss interviews you. And even the best sounding job on paper with a boss that you reckon is not going to let you try things, who is completely intolerant of failure, who is dogmatic, and who honestly just isn't an experimentalist. Even though it sounds good, keep going. There's got to be something better. So it's always, for me, if you want to become a really serious lean practitioner, it has to be a match between you, the boss of the situation. Sometimes it's hard to find, but you have to keep looking.
Just one last comment, Josh. I know we're out of time, but so I agree that fit is what that's all about. But in addition to that, find a mentor and be a mentor. That's helped me tremendously in different organizations, and you learn just as much by being a mentor as you do from your mentor.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for sharing that advice. I thought that was a wonderful question. Great way to end our session today. So we are at time. Just quickly, I want to preview kind of what's ahead. So this session, by and large, concludes our first track of the VLX, that which is focused on lean thinking's past, present, and future. We're all loaded into, many of us are loaded into the Slack community, so there will continue to be opportunities to interact there. And we have the Go Do Challenge to assist us with translating the ideas we've had exposure to this week into our own situations, our work, our businesses. So we will see you there and continue to engage in those ways. 2 weeks from, in 2 weeks, the week of September 28th and October 2nd, we'll have another track. This one with the theme, Developing the Lean Enterprise, Lessons in Leadership. We have 4 CEOs, essentially, business executives, who are going to share about the lean enterprises they have been developing over the years. So we look forward to hearing from them and to having you join us in that session. That week will continue, will be structured much in the same way that this week has been, with opportunities to interact on Slack, with opportunities to interact with one another through various scheduled activities, and a Go Do Challenge to assist us with our learning process. Then the week of October 19 through 23, the theme will be Leading Through Crisis. We're going to hear from a handful of organizations about how they've been dealing with the crises over the last 6 months, leveraging lean thinking and the capabilities that they've built in themselves and others. There's some awesome stories, including one that was sort of previewed here during this session around, what'd you say, Jim? Accountants and the legal department working on the assembly line there at GE Appliances with what I understand is excellent productivity and quality, as good as they've ever had in the past. How is that possible? Tune in to find out.
Yep. First value creating work they had ever done, or something like that. I said that. They didn't know when he said that.
Yeah.
I was really resisting that, Jim.
And then in November, for 2 weeks, we're going to focus on design feature using LPPD. I know there were a lot of questions that we received focused specifically around LPPD, kind of LPPD know-how. I purposely didn't pose those questions today because they're going to be explored in much more depth in November, and we're going to hear from practitioners themselves with concrete examples of how they're putting those ideas and practices into use. So with that, it is a wrap. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you to everyone who will watch the replay of this video at a later time. And we will see you online and remotely through Zoom, just like everyone else in our lives these days. All right, bye for now.
Thanks all.
Thank you.